We're back on day two with some more scalding hot takes, although hopefully we're not scalding this horse, which is like the sheepdog, a bit of a photorealistic horse, maybe not quite as photorealistic as the sheepdog. Anyway, let's get into the card itself. So this is not a supply card, but as you can see, it is not in the supply. It costs 3 in case that's something that matters for some kind of a trash for benefit card, most likely. Maybe for chariot race. Anyway, what it does is gives you +2 cards plus an action, and you have to return it to its pile. Basically, it's just like an experiment, but not one that you can buy or gain, and not one that comes with another experiment. It's just a horse. Worth note, there are 30 of these in the horse pile. Um, I think 30 is enough where it probably isn't going to run out too often, but it might come up. Kind of like how there's 15 spoils, and it's not super common for the spoils pile to run out, but it does happen now and then. Um, I don't know. It's very hard to know. It could happen more or less often here. Apparently, there's a bunch of cards and a few, I think, events, landscapes anyway, that do use horses. So we're going to see 3 of them today that were previewed. They're all cards. Let's get into them. So first we have supplies. It's a 2-cost treasure that gives you 1 money, and it says when you play this, gain a horse onto your deck. Uh, so a treasure that gives you 1 money is like a copper, which is pretty bad, but getting a horse gets you some draw, which is pretty good. But it is only temporary. I think, how do we think of this? It does also go, the horse goes on top of your deck, so that's something to think about. I have not mathed out what that does to your uh, like opening probabilities or anything like that. If you get this turn 3, then you have a horse on turn 4, which getting this instead of say a silver is going to hurt the hand that this is in, but it's going to help the next hand, yada yada yada. I haven't mathed any of that out. I guess I expect it probably hits 5 worse, but 6 maybe better, or 7 almost surely better than. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that too much. I imagine by the time I do the review on Making Luck, I will have mathed it out a bit more. On 5-2, well, it depends on how good a card this is in general, so let's think about that. In general, this is a card that if you always get to play the horse once for every time you play this, which is not going to quite be the case because you're always going to play this more often than the horse you get from it, because you can't ever play the horse more often because you can't play the horse without having played this. Uh, there's probably some kind of an edge case where you can crown this and get 2 horses, or counterfeit it and get 2 horses, or something like that. But anyway, uh, you play this and you can't play the horse until the next turn. And if you don't get a next turn, or you don't play the horse the next turn for whatever reason, then you've played this without getting the horse use out of it. So keep that in mind. But let's assume for a moment that you play this and you always get to play the horse you get from it. So that means that on average, this is took up 1 spot in your hand. The horse takes up a 2nd spot in your hand. You draw 2 cards. So it's like it's a cantrip um, that made you a money. I think on average this is like a peddler, but the draw part of the peddler is always delayed. And the draw part also comes in the form of a horse, which probably has some pros and cons. I think the cons typically are going to outweigh the pros just because draw later is not as good as draw now. Um, but there's potentially stockpiling, and you don't need to use it when you don't need to use it, right? You don't have to use it when you don't need to use it, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. And the other pro is that it's a card that you can, I don't know, procession or something, throne room. Um, and I guess the biggest pro is probably that because you're putting it on your deck, you're probably getting that benefit at the start of your next turn. So it's a little bit like duration draw in that way, that you're more reliable because you have this horse at the start of your turn. Although a little bit worse than duration draw maybe in the face of like a discard attack. Uh, Also, you can play the horse the same turn if you've played this and can still play actions afterwards. That means something like Black Market, something like Storyteller, or Villa, I think are the three main ways I can think of off the top of my head. There's probably others. Maybe there's others. I don't know. You tell me. Um, Overall, I think this is actually going to be quite a good card, actually. The average case being like a peddler. Peddler's like quite good. This is very cheap. Um, Obviously, it doesn't chain as well as peddler, so I think it is quite a bit worse than a two-cost peddler would be. But I still think that it's a very plausibly good card. You just don't want to take too many because it is a stop card in your deck as well, and so you can miss out. Although, again, like I say, the start of turn draw and the ability to stockpile horses if you want to probably isn't going to come up much, but might come up some. I think this is a good card, but not a great card. Slightly worse than a two-cost peddler is pretty good. Um, that puts it, I don't know, somewhere on the order of settlers. Uh, yeah, I think it's probably a little bit better than settlers in general. Um, right around median power level, maybe a bit better than median power level. Being cheap is nice. Let's move on to the next card because I've been blathering on about this one long enough. And the next card is Scrap. And it says trash a card from your hand, choose a different thing per one it costs. It says different things, so I assume they can't be the same. But the thing that you get is plus a card, plus an action, plus a buy, plus a money, gain a silver, gain a horse. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you're trashing something that costs more than 6, and I'm reading the rules on this right, then you're only getting the 6 benefits. And if you trash something that does cost 6, you must take them all, which means you have to take the silver and you have to take the horse. There's very little reason I can see why you wouldn't want a horse in your deck. Uh, Sometimes you don't want a silver, although I think that's not super often, but it could come up, I guess. Um, okay, so let's, I guess, think about this a little bit. If you're trashing, say you're opening it because you want to use it to trash estates. If you trash an estate with this, you get rid of the estate, which is good, and you take some combination of the silver, the card, and the money, probably. If you've opened with another action and you might draw it, maybe you take like the action and the card, or you don't take the card and you take like the money and the silver or the horse. Oh, you might also take the horse. What am I saying? Some combination of the card, the money, the silver, and the horse. Depends on what you want to buy. Gives you a lot of flexibility there, right? Um, that actually seems like a fine deal for a 3 cost. Uh, what else might I be trashing? A trasher. Mostly you're going to be trashing 2 costs. If you trash a 4 cost with this, what you're getting in return is like a market, or maybe something that's a little bit better than a market because you could take the silver, the horse, whatever. Um, do note that the card comes before gaining the silver or the horse, so if you've drawn your deck, you cannot gain a silver and draw it with this. I believe. I believe you do the things in order, so you can't gain a silver and then draw it, or gain a horse and then draw it, although you probably wouldn't want to draw the horse at that point if you've drawn your deck. Um, let's see, do these things chain on, let's say I have a horse in my hand or a silver in my hand. I trash the silver. I go plus a card, plus an action, gain a silver. Uh, well, I need to have another one of these. But if I do have like an infinite number of these, and there's one more card to draw, they kind of chain, and then I can just mill a bunch of silvers. That will probably not be relevant, but maybe for Conquest, you can get a bunch of these, and then like tr cantrip a bunch of silvers, regain the silver, draw another one, regain the silver, draw another, play another one of these, draw another one, and that can gain you a bunch of silvers for a conquest without necessarily, uh, bloating your deck with 20 silvers, which is going to prevent you from being able to get multiple conquests later. But I'm blathering on, and I haven't talked about how good I think this card is in general. I think it's pretty decent in general, but as far as trash for benefits go, it's not one of the best things. Getting a horse is nice. It's a nice way to thin down. Basically, I think it's a reasonable way to thin estates, but most of the other trash for benefits stuff gives you a little bit bigger benefits. Gaining the horses is the big thing here, and that it's going to help you get deck control faster, though. So as a single copy of this as an early trasher of estates, might really be worth it. Just juicing yourself with a little bit of horses to help you find this more and thin down a little bit faster. It seems pretty reasonable, probably on the order of like research. The flexibility for giving you more payload if and when you want that is also kind of nice. But it does not seem like a world beater to me. Probably a slightly below median card because if there's strong trashing at all, it probably kind of obsoletes this. This doesn't really seem like the card that you want as a trash for benefit card when you're trashing expensive things because having to play this card to get like a market effect or a market effect and gaining a silver and a horse even does not seem like it's going to be worth getting rid of whatever 6 cost I have in my deck very often at all. So I don't think you're going to want to trash expensive stuff with this very often. It really is mostly about getting rid of the card that you're trashing, and you get some nice bonuses for it, but it's not that you're getting a huge bonus for it, right? Not like Apprentice where you're drawing a ton of cards, or Salvager where you're getting a bunch of money in a buy and stuff. It gets a bit weaker on the expensive stuff trashing than those things. But let's move on to our last card of the day, and that's Livery. Livery is a 5 cost action, gives you 3 money when you play it, and it says this turn, when you gain a card costing 4 or more, gain a horse. So let's note that this is not a while in play effect. It's just an effect you get from playing the card, kind of like cargo ship, right? So if you throne room this thing, uh, whenever you gain a card costing 4 or more, you're going to gain 2 horses. If you king it, you gain 3. If you, I think those are the two main things. If you play it using an overlord, you still get the benefit, or any other command card, right? You're going to still get this benefit on the bottom. It's not a while in play effect. Uh, so do note that. 3 money on a terminal action like this, uh, first of all, makes me think that it would be better in money, but gaining the horse, less clear. I mean, gaining a horse is good in a money deck too, don't get me wrong, but gaining the horse is deck control, and deck control is something that is, well, okay, it's nice in money decks. Typically, it leads you towards the decks that are feasting on deck control, which are, decks that want to draw themselves. This helps you draw a deck. So what I'm trying to think about here is, can you get to a point where, right, you are drawing your deck, you have one of these, you want to build your payload because that's what, once you're drawing your deck, you want to do, but you need to keep adding draw so that you can continue to draw your deck as you're adding that payload. Is this a card that can let you, as you're buying more payload cards, continue to just like take care of the deck control bit for you? And I think that's not quite true. Just because, yes, any payload cards I add this turn, it will cover in terms of horses, right? If I add a payload card, that's 1 extra stop card in my deck. I'm assuming the payload card is a stop card. But I've added a horse to my deck, which draws an additional card. So it draws basically the payload card. So it will cover me for 1 turn. But then the next turn, I've used the horse to draw this payload card. And if I'm adding more payload cards, then there's no dice. So, like, at first glance, it doesn't quite do that. It does alleviate some of the problems, but it doesn't totally cover you forever. The question is just, let's say I have two of these, right? Then I buy a payload and some number of payload cards, and I get two horses for each one. I only need to use one of the horses, although at some point I'm going to have to use horses to draw horses, maybe. Uh, that might cost me like one extra horse. But for the most part, it should just be that I'm only spending the number of horses I have for this turn on the next stuff. But then if I'm playing two of these, right, and I add a bunch of payload cards, then I have an extra horse. So I'm drawing my stuff again the next turn. And then as I continue to add payload cards or green, right, this also works for green, not just payload cards, I have extra horses. So I think you can almost use this to take care of your deck control and as a way to add payload. You might still be wanting to add, a little bit of other deck control, but I think once you get multiple plays of this effect, um, you can skew towards adding way more payload versus deck control than you normally would from the point that you're drawing your deck, which makes this very strong for decks that are drawing themselves. And I think that might really push you towards that direction, assuming that you have plentiful enough villages to play a few of these and or your terminals, terminal payload cards. Um, but I also expect this card to be like quite good in money decks. Like I say, I don't know that it promotes money, but if you are playing a money deck, obviously I should note all this stuff I'm talking about payload, I'm talking about whatever. You do need the card to cost 4 or more. If you're not getting cards that cost 4 or more, this is pretty lousy. Um, Most cards you're going to want to get do cost 4 or more, but there's a decent number of cards that are cheaper than that. And this does not work well with them. So please do keep that in mind, right? And especially, let's note, cost reduction, including peddlers, which I've been talking about peddler a lot, but peddler itself, as well as, highway, bridge, quarry, uh, inventor, all of that kind of stuff uh, where you're gaining cards, where you're making cards cheaper before you gain them. Um, if you could somehow make horses more expensive, you could empty the horse pile, but I don't think there will be a way to make horses more expensive. Anyway, the point is, if you're doing cost reduction, then this card does not work well with cost reduction, which is not super common. I guess trash for benefit cards are the main other cards that don't work well with cost reduction. Here's another card that doesn't work well with cost reduction. Uh, I think it's going to be very good in as payload for decks that are trying to draw themselves, providing that what they want to be adding to their deck are cards that are 4 or more expensive. To the extent you're wanting to add cheaper cards, this is not so good for those decks. I mean, it's okay, but if you're wanting to add a lot of cheaper cards, this looks a lot more lackluster. You also do need to have sufficient villages for this to work out for you. Um, in money decks, I don't think it promotes them, but it is pretty good in them. Um, right? With 3 money, you're very likely to be buying a card that costs 4 or more, um, because you're unlikely to have just all non-economic cards with the rest of your cards. In which case, even just like, okay, it's a 5 cost and let me buy a silver. I guess if you have too many terminals, that might come up. But more than likely you'll hit 4, more than likely you'll hit 5. You could at least get one of these, another one of these, or a duchy or something. And just 3 money on a 5 cost is pretty decent for money. And then also gaining you a little bit of extra draw, which is economic, is also, fine. It's temporary. And in general with horses, and in particular probably in money decks, knowing when to not play them, kind of like with spoils, is going to be an important skill. Uh, Most of the time you just fire them off, like as soon as you draw them, unless it's overdrawing. And or in money decks, if you already have 8 or something, you obviously don't need to fire it off. But knowing when to say, okay, I already have 6, and getting more money in this hand isn't really going to help me very much, because gold is about as good as anything else I'd be buying anyway, so I'm going to stop here and save my horse for later. That's an important, small but significant skill in those kinds of decks. Anyway, I think Livery is going to be a very strong card. This is going to be the strongest card of the day. Not as probably as strong as Barge from yesterday, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's stronger than Kiln. I think this is going to be very good top quarter or so card in the game in general. This card's a bit weaker, I think, Scrap. Um, Maybe weaker than average. Niche, maybe not niche exactly, but if there's no other reasonable trashing, this card will have a place for. I shouldn't say for sure, but it's a lot better than Trade Route, right? But not that great compared to a lot of the other trash for benefit cards, but a fine card. And then supplies is probably still the hardest to evaluate, but I think it's going to be pretty good because it's very, very vaguely like a peddler. Um, anyway, that does it for today. We'll be back tomorrow with some more previews from Dominion Menagerie.